Hello everyone, Herb Grover here. I'd like to update you on a project that we've been doing with Weminuche Audubon Society in collaboration with Audubon Rockies and United States Forest Service through Pagosa Ranger District, and then also in collaboration with the San Juan Headwaters Forest Health Partnership. Now in this video we'll be hearing from Gene Cernhelt, president of our Weminuche Audubon chapter, and also Keith Bruno. Keith is a Southwest community naturalist with Audubon Rockies. He does a great job of bringing some educational programs to our community for our youth and our adults. If it weren't for him, I'm not sure we'd have the kind of enthusiasm among our membership that we do for this project and all of the other things that we do. We have other videos and a report from our first sampling season, and I'll post links to that here on the screen and in the comment section below. But what we've done is come out and sample 3 different locations that have been subject to different wildland fuel treatment methods. One of them has been subject to prescribed fire. That's the Turkey Springs site, and that was burned actually the beginning of last year. And then our Fawn Gulch site, which was masticated, that's the term we use. That basically means that the shrub layer was mowed down in 2017. And then this Jackson Mountain site, which as far as we know hasn't been logged or treated in any way. So we wouldn't say that it's a control site because it is an over mature Ponderosa Pine or dry mixed conifer forest, but it certainly provides a contrast to our other 2 sites. This is a citizen science project, and if you want to know what a citizen science project is, just think about the name. It is a project that's conducted by citizens. And so I have a background in the sciences. I've been teaching ecology for a number of years. And so I've just kind of helped coordinate it. And Keith and Gene have stepped up and kept things organized as well. We're going to talk some more about the results that we found in 2019 and 2020 in this video, and we hope you enjoy it. So stay tuned.
I think this project has been one of the most exciting things that our group has done for a lot of reasons. I read recently in the Cornell magazine that eBird and citizen science is more and more becoming a real tool for the scientific community in tracking bird populations. And I think it just did a lot of things for members in our group. Number 1, it got us out in the woods, especially this time, at a really important time, so we could get out safely and enjoy watching birds. I did notice, just from my experience and from going out with other groups, that people have really improved their birding skills from last year.
This project has been a perfect demonstration of what happens when you get a number of people together, common interest, and clear goals. And in my opinion, this project has been a success because we've got people out into the forest. We're educating them not only about forest ecology and working on our birding skills, but also we're involved with a number of other organizations here locally that are all striving to understand better the implications of climate change and how that may shape these largely dominated Ponderosa Pine forests here in southwestern Colorado. There's a shortage of information about how birds respond to fuels reduction treatments in the West. And what we're doing may not give us a crystal clear picture of how birds are responding to those treatments, but we're going to keep doing what we're doing. And I think by doing so, we will get a better understanding of how birds may respond to some of these individual treatments and how they may be responding in the long run to climate change as well.
Well, I'm standing next to one of the sample points at Turkey Springs, Be a good time to describe our methodology for this study. At each of our locations, we set up 3 loops, and each of those loops consisted of 5 sample points, like the one that you see here. Teams of observers were asked to visit each point on a loop, and at that point, identify all the birds that they could by sight or by sound. And they did this for 6 minutes, a 6-minute interval. This is a pretty standard method for bird monitoring. Now, as I said, there are 3 loops at each site, and each loop consists of 5 of these sample points. Each team of observers, usually 2 people, sometimes 3, were asked to visit 2 loops at an assigned site at least 4 times over a 4-week period. They did this in 2019 and again in 2020. Now in 2019, each site received at least 10 site visits. In 2020, we asked each team to not only visit 2 loops at their assigned sites, but also to visit 2 loops at each of the other 2 sites that they were not assigned as well. We also encouraged teams of observers to join together and to share in their experience of visiting their loops at their assigned sites. This worked out really well. In 2020, most of our loops received 17 visits. That was a substantial increase in sample intensity in 2020 versus 2019, and is partly responsible for the increased number of bird species that were documented this year compared to the first year.
So what did we find when we look at the birds that we recorded this year and last year? Well, I think one thing that's really important is that there were 40 bird species commonly cited in both years. I think even more interesting is that those 40 species represented 95% of the sightings that were made. What differences did we have? In 2020, we saw 18 species that we did not see in 2019. In 2019, we saw 14 species that we did not see this year. So when you add all of those numbers up, in total in both years, we've recorded 72 different species of birds at our 3 sites.
Let's talk a little bit further about species per site, because I think that's where the numbers get a little more interesting. In 2019, the Fawn Gulch was our top species producer with 34 species. Jackson Mountain being the second with 33 species, and Turkey Springs with 26 species. The top species producer 2020 was Jackson Mountain, 45 species. Fawn Gulch coming in at 39 species, so second. So those 1 and 2 places swapped, and then Turkey Springs again in third with 37 species.
What are the top species? Not surprisingly, number 1 was the American robin. Number 2, the violet green swallow. Number 3, the western wood pewee. And you might expect that being out here in a Ponderosa Pine forest. Number 4, the pygmy nuthatch. And I will say those guys entertained us with several nest sightings this year. And number 5, this was no surprise to me either, is the northern flicker.
Well, from our discussions thus far and from other data that we've presented in our report, here are some of the takeaways. Well, first of all, there were a greater number of birds documented in 2020 relative to 2019. That represents year-to-year variability, that we don't quite understand all of the contributing factors, but also it reflects, we think, an improvement in conditions at Turkey Springs a year following prescribed fire in 2019. And then also an increased sample density. We had more people as observers, we had more frequent visits at all of our sites, and many of us improved our birding skills. All of that contributed to that increased number of bird species observed and also the abundance of the birds that were observed. Now, in our report, we also discussed the use of some very, very basic indices of species diversity. And from those indices, we can conclude that our 2020 data set reflected bird communities that were more diverse than we observed in 2019. Now, one important question to ask is, why are birds attracted to a particular place in any given year? Now, there are many contributing factors, but of course the availability of food and nesting sites is always going to be very prominent in that regard. So let's take a quick look at each of these factors. We're going to talk about feeding habits first, and then we'll also discuss nesting behaviors. Now, in both years of our data set, and this is again covered in detail in our reports, we categorized bird species according to their common feeding habits. Many of the species that we observed will shift from insectivorous to granivorous or frugivorous, in other words, eating fruits or seeds, at certain times of the year or in certain habitats. But by and large, in our location, at the time of year that we're studying the bird community, they're pretty much all insectivorous. So then they're categorized based on where do they seek their food resources and how is that resource partitioned among species. So we have some species that are ground brush foraging. Those are most common across all three sites, as you can see in the graph on your screen. And the most common examples of species that are in this category include the American robin and even the northern flicker. So these increased markedly at Turkey Springs, which again we think represents the recovery of the shrub layer following that prescribed fire in 2019, with small shifts in numbers at Fawn Gulch and Jackson Mountain, which may reflect sampling density but then also year-to-year variability. We also have a category called timber foliage searching species. These were the second or third most common species at all three sites. The most common examples of these include the Steller's jay, western tanager, and yellow-rumped warblers, and these were again commonly sighted at all three sites. The number of these showed notable increases in 2020 relative to 2019. Again, you can see that in the graph on your screen. There were other categories in these feeding guilds, the term that we use here, and those are discussed in our report. The numbers of species in those, the flycatcher and aerial flycatcher groupings, were relatively small in terms of numbers of species, but in terms of numbers of birds, they did represent a significant component of the bird communities in the sites that we studied. Well, the bird species that we document in this project represent an important component of the food web in these forest ecosystems. And by controlling insect populations, they of course help maintain the health of the primary producers, the tree and shrub and herbs that are present in the forest, and lower the prospect of insect outbreaks that can be damaging to the forest. The next thing we want to talk about is nesting behavior. Now, bird species can be categorized according to where or how they build their nests. So, for example, some just build their nests on the ground. Common nighthawk, for example. We observed nests of the common nighthawk at one of our sites at Turkey Springs. They may build cup-like nests that many of us are familiar with, and those could occur in shrubs, near the ground, or higher up in the forest canopy, either in the foliage or along branches. They may also choose to put their nests on ledges or in cavities. Now, while we encounter bird nests in virtually every form in our study, the nesting behavior we're most interested in our report are cavity nesters, and I'll describe why coming up. So these are birds that rely on openings in either dead snags or weakened wood on living trees. And these cavities are excavated by the birds themselves or by other species of birds. So it turns out that some cavity nesters are what we call primary excavators. In other words, they seek out weakened wood, either again on dead snags or on living trees, maybe underneath the placement of a dead branch or a place like that, and then they will excavate a cavity where they will construct their nests. Other species are secondary cavity nesters, and what they're doing is they're occupying cavities that were excavated by another species. And so we talk about these primary cavity nesters in some cases as keystone species. An example of that would be the northern flicker, because they're fairly prolific. They're one of the common bird species that we observed in our study, and they tend to excavate a new cavity each year. But then there are other species that rely on those cavities that species like the northern flicker have constructed, and these include the black-capped chickadee, for example, and the pygmy nuthatch. So we use this term keystone species to represent a species that is more important than its numbers might reflect. And we also now talk about the relationship between primary and secondary cavity nesters as forming something like a nest web. And if you're familiar with the term food web, it's the same kind of concept. So the example again of primary excavators includes the northern flicker and the hairy woodpecker. Those are two of the fairly common primary cavity nesting species in our study. And the secondary cavity nesters, as I mentioned earlier, included the black-capped chickadee and the pygmy nuthatch. Now, of the 72 bird species recorded in our study, 18 are cavity nesters. There were 4 species that are primary cavity nesting species. I already mentioned a couple of these, the northern flicker and the hairy woodpecker, but add to that the downy woodpecker and Williamson sapsucker. Those were seen in lesser numbers and less frequently in our observations. There were 9 species that are secondary cavity nesting species. These include the house wren, which was observed in a number of cases, forming its nest on dead snags. Mountain chickadee, a violet green swallow, which was abundant at a couple of our sites. The western bluebird, which again was relatively common across many of our sites. And the white-breasted nuthatch, which was also commonly seen. Then there are 5 species that may be primary cavity nesters or secondary cavity nesting species. And these include the black-capped chickadee that I mentioned earlier, the Lewis's woodpecker, which was only observed infrequently in our data set, the red-naped sapsucker and red-breasted nuthatch, which were also among the less common species that were recorded in our study. Well, now let's hear from Jean and Keith, and they're going to talk about some of the observations that we've made about nesting behavior in our study.
We think about Fawn Gulch, we think here at this site, Fawn Gulch, we have again noticed this, species diversity that seems to kind of move with this 15 to 20 foot high gamble oak clumps. That's kind of unique to this site. Jackson Mountain has some of that too. However, it's got a lot of other species composition pieces to consider. Turkey Springs, pretty much devoid of that kind of 15-foot oak stand that you see in there. So I think in time, this Fawn Gulch site, we might, as the oak continues to fill in these bigger clumps, we might see even more species richness there. And Turkey Springs may follow with that suit as well. Jackson Mountain will probably stay as it is. We actually saw a Cordilleran flycatcher beginning to nest. We're not sure if it aborted the nest. It seems like that's what happened. White-breasted nuthatch nested in this one with success this year, which was really fun to see.
This is a great example of an important nesting site for birds. This particular snag happens to be on Jackson Mountain, and we witnessed house wrens, violet green swallows, Williamson sapsuckers, all nesting and feeding young in this particular snag. I think in recent years, the Forest Service has come to recognize how valuable snags are in a forest for birds. Not too many years ago, Weminuche Audubon Society members participated in labeling snags out in the Turkey Springs area as wildlife trees to prevent someone coming out looking for firewood and cutting these valuable trees down. You can see there are a lot of knot holes in this tree. I think actually the swallows nested in a hollow at the very top of the tree. Oh, and right now there's one of our nesters coming down the tree, a pygmy nuthatch.
Well, we spend a little bit of time in our first and second year reports talking about species that we identified in our project that are of particular concern to conservation biologists. Now, one of those species is the Lewis's woodpecker, which we only saw infrequently in our data set, but it's actually relatively common in some areas around Pagosa Springs. This is, again, a weak primary cavity nester, but primarily a secondary cavity nester, and its worldwide population is only estimated to be about 69,000 individuals. Now, among the other bird species that are listed as of concern or in decline, largely because of habitat fragmentation or habitat loss, includes the Virginia warbler, Cason's finch, the common nighthawk, pine siskins, band-tailed pigeon, which we saw in 2020 but not in 2019, and Grace's warbler, which again was an incidental in 2019 but seen a little bit more frequently in 2020. So we found it rather interesting and hopeful that we were able to identify these species in our area. Let's say a few words about what we consider to be the major successes of this project. First of all, the scientific question that we set out to address, which involved the potential response of the bird community to wildland fuel reduction treatments. Now, that still remains somewhat of an open question, largely because we don't yet understand the significance of year-to-year variability in terms of the responsiveness of the bird community to those kinds of disturbances. Nonetheless, we consider a number of the outcomes of this study to be great successes. First of all, this provided a valuable educational experience for multiple generations of birders. Several of us brought our grandchildren out, for example, so those young people had an opportunity to not only learn birding skills, but also engage in a scientific study. We had a number of our participants who are youth who we've supported in going to various bird camps over the last several years. The birding skills of our participants improved, and many of those self-reported that as well. And then we had an expanded dialogue between stakeholders, meaning the public, and forest managers. And we've done that through a number of different educational workshops and meetings of where we discussed our findings and so forth. We've improved the scientific literacy among our participants. In other words, by discussing feeding habits and nesting behaviors of the birds that we're observing, I think the understanding of how the food web and nesting web interacts to produce a healthy forest becomes more real for all of us involved. And then finally, we've also strengthened this sense of community and enhanced a conservation ethic among our participants. That was already strong to begin with, but again, by engaging in a project together, I think again it enhances that sense of camaraderie. Well, the obvious question is, where do we go from here? Do we just stop now, or do we continue with the study? And I think the general consensus is that we should continue this monitoring program. We'd very much like to improve our data set and follow up on several of these successes that I've just described. We may be able to expand our monitoring activities to include a project that's underway at Jackson Mountain. It's called the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Project. And this is being run through the faculty at Colorado State University, and they're going to be managing portions of the forest in ways that they think will enhance its resilience to future warming and drying conditions that we are anticipating in response to climate change. Developing a baseline data set for the composition and structure of the bird community certainly would be an important contribution to that study. Finally, we want to quantify some of these successes that we've kind of talked about. Now, we get personal statements coming back to us, feedback of various kinds that tends to be very positive. Well, we'd like to know a little bit more about how do our participants feel that they've improved their birding skills and improved their understanding of forest ecology and fire ecology and things like that. So we're going to try to conduct a survey that's scientifically designed to quantify how our participants have been impacted by the process of participating and contributing to this study. Now here's some final thoughts based on our interpretation from our data set and the kinds of inferences that we can make from this data set. First of all, fuel reduction treatments certainly simplify forest composition and structure in the short term, at least with regard to the shrub layer, the forest floor. And this leads to local and short-term reduction in the number of bird species and abundance in those locales where prescribed fire or mastication takes place. However, recovery appears to be fairly quick, within a year or two. The interannual variability in bird community structure and composition is not very well understood. And again, there are many factors that contribute to that, but the only way we can discern the significance of wildland fuel treatments and those sorts of things to this year-to-year variability is by extending our study across another year or two or three or four. In other words, long-term studies are important. Dead snags, as we've been able to observe and document, are extremely important for cavity nesting species, and we can't overemphasize that too much. So we have to take an approach that protects those dead snags from firewood cutters or even the effects of prescribed fire. Finally, landscape heterogeneity, this patchiness that we create by conducting prescribed fire in certain locations and thinning activities in other locations, is a good thing. It produces heterogeneity in habitat quality and types of habitat that the bird community responds to. And so as we increase the diversity and abundance of birds in the forest, that promotes forest health. Because again, as we mentioned earlier, most of these birds are feeding on insects, which can create problems for the condition of the forest if the population numbers are not kept under control by predation. So overall, our study tends to support the kinds of management practices that we see underway in our forests today. And the more we do to understand how the bird community composition and its structure changes from one year to the next, the better able we are to anticipate what the consequences of our management practices are likely to be. Well, we hope you found this video interesting and informative, and maybe even a little bit encouraging, particularly with regard to the potential contributions you might be able to make to our study. If you're interested in participating in our 2021 study year, stay tuned. We have a website and a Facebook site, and we send out newsletters. So I encourage you all to, if you're not currently a member of Weminuche Audubon Society, well, join up. It's not that expensive. And we're a great group of folks. And then follow us on Facebook if you choose, or through our website and our newsletters. And we'll be announcing opportunities to participate in birding workshops. We have one coming up, for example, on birding by song. Get involved. It's a great way to get out into nature with people that I'm sure you'll enjoy your time with. That's all for now. Again, we hope you enjoyed this video, you benefited from it. Let us know what you think. We'll be seeing you around.